Welcome back to Centered. My name is Zach, and I'm the Director of Spiritual Formation here at One Life Church, and this is the kickoff of week 4 of Centered. And Centered is all about exploring the Christ-centered worldview, and our working definition of worldview is what you believe about the most important and meaningful questions of life. And we state it that way because everyone has a worldview. You may not know exactly what your worldview is, but you do have an answer to all these questions, and those answers sort of make up the worldview. Last week we looked at the question of who am I, asking what human beings are, and we found out that the Christ-centered worldview's answer to that is that we are human beings are made in the image of God, and therefore have inherent value and meaning and purpose. Well, today we're going to explore the next worldview question, and that is what's wrong, asking what's wrong with the world. And so today is going to be a little bit different because we always go through the grid, and we will hit all the points on the grid again, but today we'll kind of move around and jump around the grid a little bit. But like always, I want to lay out the grid before we get started so you can just put that to memory, because I think it's a great resource for you to have going forward. As you hear claims being made in culture, you can think through this grid, and I think it can be helpful as we compare worldviews. So, looking back to the grid, the first thing on the grid is claims, and what are the claims being made? What is each worldview's claims to answering these questions? And so, once we have the claims, we move to 2, the reasons. What are the reasons such claims are being made? This would include evidence and that kind of thing. The third thing on the grid is implications, and that is the way we have been thinking about that is if this claim is true, then it means this. So what are the implications in other areas of our life? And 4, because our worldviews are not simply knowledge that lives in our head, we move to actions, because every worldview inspires actions one way or another if they're being lived consistently. And so the 4th thing we do is move to actions and ask what actions should this inspire, or how should we live in response to this claim. And so, like always, we want to open this session by watching a short film that was produced by our creative arts team, and then we'll come back and discuss it.
Human beings are amazing. We carry inside our heads the single most complex organ in the known universe. That weird-looking 3-pound mass contains as many interconnections as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. As a result, our accomplishments can be jaw-dropping, from gymnastics to the Sistine Chapel, Apollo 11, medical technology, robotics, people relating and laughing, doing math. Then there's the invention of chips and salsa. When we are on, we are on. It's really quite remarkable. We fill the world with love, art, innovation, kindness, caring laughter, beauty, and cuteness. But that's not the whole story. With all that's right, something's wrong. We know it. We live with it every day. We see it when we look out the window. We see it when we look in the mirror. We experience it at work and in our homes. If we can stand to look at the news, we see the extreme expressions of it.
Wildfire response to the shooting.
Call it corruption. Call it a failure to live up to an ideal. Call it, in some cases, evil. Whatever you call it, there's a stain on life. There's a stain on us. If we took inventory of all the good things people bring to life, it would be an extraordinary list. At the same time, if we were gut-level honest and listed off all the bad things people brought to life, the 2 lists might end up being very close to the same length. This corruption runs from subtle to monumental. We all experience those little injustices and selfish acts committed by our neighbors, co-workers, even spouses and friends, and, transparency time, ourselves. We slight one another or intentionally ignore each other. We prefer ourselves over one another. We dish out insults, we claim to be tolerant until we discover someone actually sees the world differently from us. We're inconsiderate. We can't believe how selfish or annoying others can be. We explode in anger or shrink back and silently fume, blown away and frustrated by people's obviously wrong behavior. We also know there are deeper, darker sins that run through our society, evil hidden behind smiles and normal lives. Studies by the Crimes Against Children Research Center shows that 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys is a victim of child sexual abuse. According to a National Institute of Justice report, 3 out of 4 adolescents who have been sexually assaulted were victimized by someone they knew well. In other words, someone they thought they could trust. Then there's the not-so-subtle stuff that makes it to the news. Every day, reports pour in about robberies, murders, shootings, sex trafficking, gang violence, greed, exploitation, modern slavery, and child neglect. Modern slavery is a $150 billion per year industry. International Justice Mission estimated that roughly 40.3 million individuals are currently caught in the slave trade. They also report that 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery is a child. And what makes these facts even more disturbing is while we blame the slave traders themselves, the industry wouldn't exist if it didn't have customers. In other words, all over the world, people are enslaving other people, and very commonly, those slaves are children. On average, around the world, 68,000 deaths a year occurred in natural disasters. In the year 2016 alone, 385,000 deaths occurred due to murder. Something's wrong. The world is broken. We are broken. Then there's the corruption that has made the history books. We're all familiar with the Nazi genocide, but we should never forget the lesser-known evils which killed millions within one single century. The killing fields of Cambodia, with over 1 million murders. Stalin's man-made famine, estimated to have killed as many as 12 million people, and that's not counting the massive numbers he condemned to the gulags. Or there's China's Cultural Revolution, thought to be responsible for 3 million deaths, which came after Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward, which is thought to have caused 45 million unnecessary deaths, including 2.5 million who were summarily killed or tortured. The list has gone on enough. From personal annoyances to state-sponsored genocide, it's undeniable that something courses through our veins that's poisonous. Our worldview is formed by our answer to the question, what is wrong? Is it a lack of education or opportunity? Is it a reversion to our evolved animal and savage selves? The Christ-centered worldview includes a straightforward story that has a lot of explanatory power. God created the world good. He entrusts it to mankind as stewards. Man chooses to reject God's way of doing things. Poison is injected into the entire system. As a result, all of us, while still created in God's image and therefore valuable and capable of great things, also carry a kind of virus whose effects are sometimes easy to see and other times, well, disguised. But always, in all of us. The Christ-centered worldview is summed up well by a story from the early 20th century. When a newspaper posed the question, "What's wrong with the world?" the Catholic thinker G.K. Chesterton reputedly wrote a brief letter in response. "Dear Sirs, I am. Sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton."
Okay, like I said, this week is going to be a little bit different. Rather than going through a number of different claims to kick off, we're just going to give you the claims of the Christ-centered worldview, and then we'll look at the reasons the Christ-centered worldview makes those claims, and then we'll kind of return back to some of the cultural statements that consist of the claims. So when it comes to the question of what's wrong with the world, throughout history, a number of different terms and illustrations and metaphors have been used throughout the history of Christian thought. But I thought the film stated it as good as anything else. And the quote from the film is that God created the world good. He entrusted it to mankind as stewards. Man chooses to reject God's way of doing things. and poison is injected into the entire system. And so, keeping that in mind, we're going to explore the reasons why the Christ-centered worldview would say such a thing. And for us to do that, we are going to look at a number of different sections of Scripture. Most of them will be written from Paul, and Paul was a first century Jesus follower, and around AD 56, he wrote a letter to the church in Rome, which is now titled Romans, and in this letter, Paul addresses this sort of question. And so the first verse we're going to look at is Romans 7. And as I read through these passages, as they're on your screen, just jot down some of your thoughts in the participation guide on how each of these verses support the Christ-centered claim of what's wrong in the world, the way that it was stated earlier. Okay, so we're going to start with a pretty good chunk here, Romans 7, 18 through 25. I'm going to put it on the screen, and we'll read it together. This is Paul writing to the church in Rome. He says, "For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have a desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I don't want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it's no longer I who do it, but it's the sin living in me that does it. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil's right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, I myself, in my mind, am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature, a slave to the law of sin." And so that's some language that we don't necessarily use, but we can all kind of understand the sentiment when Paul's saying, it's bizarre. The good that I want to do, I don't do, and then the bad I want to stop, I keep doing. And so he's just pointing out that Paul is a man that is seeking God, that is in relationship with God, but even still there is something fighting in him that keeps him from always doing good. The next passage is a really short little verse in Romans 3:23, and we'll throw it up on the screen here. Romans 3:23 simply says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Strictly pointing out that there is no perfect person other than Christ, that everyone has that same struggle. And then again, still in the book of Romans 8:19 through 22, "For all creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." And from this section of Romans here, we see that it's more even than just man. There's a wrong, there's a poison that has, like it says in the film, been injected into the whole system. And Romans sort of states that all creation is subject to frustration, and they're groaning in the pains of childbirth, that it's waiting to be revealed back to its glory. And so just looking at those and taking a minute to pause, just what did you find? What scriptures support those claims that we have in regard to this question? So just take a moment to fill that out, and then we'll move on. So now that we've looked at the Christ-centered worldview's claims when it comes to this question, and we've also given the reasons why they hold that claim, looking back at Romans, now we're going to kind of circle back and look at some of the general claims of other areas of culture when it comes to this question. And it's pretty difficult to have a big comparative worldview discussion on the larger question of what's wrong with the world. The majority of worldviews would have some general claim to the idea that something is off, in agreement there. We would all be in agreement there. But where it kind of gets varied and gets interesting when it comes to the general idea of right and wrong. So we are going to explore that a little bit. And to start that, I want to think through a question that may seem just really easy off the top, but actually process it a little bit. Think through your life, through your actions, through the conversations you have, and just process that and see if you think this is true or false. So the question is, do you think that there is an actual right or wrong, or do you think that throughout history, people have sort of just made up rules and categories of right and wrong? And then what makes you say that? So again, is there a real thing that is right and wrong, or is the idea that we have of right and wrong now simply something that has been made up through history and has now become sort of declared that? So many people today in our culture would claim that, and this sneaks into the Christ-centered worldview at times too, that right and wrong is different for each person, or that right and wrong differs from culture to culture. And these two views are kind of the dominant position in our culture, probably, and that makes them worth exploring. And so we're going to look at two. And the first is called individual moral relativism. And it's a big word, or a big phrase to simply mean that, to argue that right and wrong changes from person to person. It can be true for you, but not true for me. So again, the idea of individual moral relativism is that sort of right and wrong are up for each person to decide. There are no universal moral truths. There's no right and wrong that's true for everyone all the time. And so just a simple illustration of this or example of this is, let's say that I think that littering is morally wrong, and my friend thinks littering is not morally wrong. It might be against the law, but there's nothing morally wrong about littering. Individual moral relativism would say that we are both right, or at the very least, neither of us are wrong. And there are a number of other examples to that. You could probably just think through a few on your own, and you'd have plenty of examples of individual moral relativism. Now, the second one is cultural moral relativism, and that's the belief that right and wrong changes from culture to culture. So again, there is no moral truth that is right for all people for all time. It can vary from culture to culture, and a simple illustration of this might be that women should have to cover their heads. Some cultures think that's morally wrong, some do not. Obviously, cultural moral relativism would say that both are right, or again, that none is wrong. Or another illustration, this is one that I actually had experience with myself. I went to, when I was in college, I stayed in Africa and Tanzania for 3 months, and there was a major issue because one of the tribes we were working with was getting ridiculed a bit from outside countries and outside organizations because they have really late and elaborate ceremonies of circumcision and things like that, which others see as mutilation and that kind of stuff. And you'd see anthropologists and people saying, well, that's their culture, that's their right, and others saying, no, that's wrong, and it's always wrong. And so, in this situation, when it comes to cultural moral relativism, we might say, that type of mutilation is okay for them, but it's wrong for us. So that's the idea of cultural moral relativism. And this points to a place, and I think this is in your participation guide too, this idea of self-defeating statements. This is just a principle of logic that I think usually lends itself well to this discussion when it comes to right and wrong. And a self-defeating statement is simply an idea that is false as a logical consequence of actually holding it to be true. So that is very confusing, but I can give you a few examples, and we'll put some up there. One that we might hear a lot of self-defeating statement is that someone who might say right and wrong, you shouldn't push right and wrong on anyone. Well, that's actually a self-defeating statement because that person is actually saying the same thing to you. You know, they're telling you right and wrong then. Your friend is making a moral statement, trying to get you to agree with his idea of right and wrong. And I just put some other ones up on a slide here, some sillier ones, but like never use the word never. That's obvious. As soon as you say it, it's not true anymore. No sentence is longer than 3 words. This is, again, one that we hear in culture. There are no moral absolutes, so you ought to stop judging the beliefs and behaviors of others. Well, as soon as you say that, it becomes not true because you are instating that, judging others. There is no such thing as truth. That is a truth claim in itself. Or finally, only stupid people use insults. And then recently, I actually saw Tim Keller, who is a longtime pastor in New York. He made an interesting insight on culture that I think, again, points to these self-defeating statements and also points to inconsistently holding some of our claims. So this is what he said in this slide, in a tweet. He said, 2 seemingly contradictory currents mark our society. 1, there is a denunciation of all claims of absolute truth. But 2, there is also a fanaticism in which one person or group is absolutely right, nothing is ambiguous, and divergent views should be destroyed. And he's pointing to something, he's actually pointing out the inconsistency of a lot of our worldviews. Because as you can see, if these 2 things shouldn't be true together, they are self-defeating, that you can't claim that there is no such thing as this absolute truth, but then claim that your position is absolutely true in all circumstances. And so what's difficult about the issue, and I think why we all struggle with it, is because we want to be loving and we want to be compassionate and graceful people. And we look at the definitions of individual and cultural relativism and we think, that sounds right. I don't want to tell people, if they're right or wrong. And it comes from a good place. And trust me, I'm not telling you to go around telling people they're right and wrong. But we want to look at those views and actually see if they match up with the reality of our lived experience, or if it's just us inconsistently trying to work around our worldview. So we're going to do a little thought experiment around the implications to help us do that. To look at the implications, we're going to look at a couple of different examples and take you through a thought experiment as we think through those. And they'll all be up in your participation guide, but I'll read them, the example, and we'll put the questions up that go along with it. And then feel free to pause as long as you need to. We take as much time as you need to process these well and think through them, because what we want to see is that if we want to live consistently in our worldview, then we have to live consistently with the implications. So we're gonna point to some implications here and work from there. So let's put up example 1, and that is modern day slavery. In the film, you heard that modern day slavery is a $150 billion a year industry. 40.3 million individuals are currently caught in the slave trade, and 1 out of 4 of those is a child. And so now I'm going to read quickly through the questions and then go back and take as much time as you need to process those. So the first question is, when you see that example, what's your gut reaction to the statement? Just what is your first thought? And 2, do you think it's okay for some countries or cultures to engage in slavery if it's agreed upon by the majority? 3, is the wrongness of slavery a personal opinion? Ask another way: if you think that selling slave, or if you think the slave trade is wrong, but your friend thinks it's no big deal, are you both right? And 4, if they were being consistent with their worldview, how would the individual moral relativist have to answer that question? Likewise, how would a cultural moral relativist have to answer that question? Okay, moving on to example 2, and it's almost an example you shouldn't use because it's so bad. but we'll look at it anyways because we have to deal with it. It's in its most basic form. This is a great example of the things you have to think through when you're comparing individual moral relativism or some form of cultural moral relativism, or the idea that there is no such thing as moral truth. These are examples you have to process. They're examples from our history. So the second example we'll throw up there is from World War II. It says in 1933, a man named Hitler was appointed to the head of the German state. And Hitler, along with his party, believed that there were hierarchies of different races. Some were superior, some were inferior. Not only that, Hitler also worked to eliminate all disabled people, homosexuals, and other minorities that didn't fit into his idea of the Aryan race. From 1941 to 1945, Hitler and the Nazi Party systematically killed 6 million Jews, and an estimated 1 million of which were children. Again, we look at this real example of this real thing that happened in history and have to ask and have to work in reverse a bit from there. And so let's just ask these questions again. We'll put them up, and then you can take as much time as you want. Again, the first question is, what is your first gut reaction to this? The second, do you believe that Hitler's actions were wrong for all people in all cultures at all times? And if so, why? 3, which is the next big question, is if we all sense that the answer is that Hitler's actions were wrong for all people in all cultures and all times, who then gets to declare or decide what is right and wrong? How do we make the call? And we have to remember that Hitler had the majority with him, so he wasn't acting alone. So the answer can't be based on some kind of majority thing. 4, if a moral relativist, which many in our culture, believers included, seem to be, is actually living out their worldview consistently, what would they have to say about modern-day slavery or the Holocaust? And 5, if a person responds with, we just instinctively know that's wrong after years and years of sort of evolving as a culture, then it comes back to this question of how do we know that and who decides that for us? This is where the Christ-centered worldview's claim is vastly different from both individual and cultural moral relativism. Because the Christ-centered worldview claims that there are some things that are right and wrong for all times, for everyone. For Christians, for the Christ followers, rather than individual preference or majority, right and wrong are determined by God, and more specifically, by the character of God. So in an oversimplified sense, right is when when reality or our action aligns with the character of God. So things like love, goodness, truth. And wrong is when reality or our actions don't align with the characteristics of God, which is what we would have seen in the Hitler example. So our morals are determined by who God is, and we actually find the clearest picture of who God is in the life of Jesus. And so, although we might say that there is truth may be progressive in some sense, it's always rooted in the character of God and nature of God. So although more may be revealed, it's always in the buried and grounded in the absolute nature of God. And so finally, we want to look at the fourth thing in our grid, actions. And not only does Scripture help us understand what's wrong, but it also gives us a picture of what is right. It lays out what it looks like to live out God's vision of life. And so we want to take a few minutes and just look at that. We've said what's wrong with the world, but thankfully the Christ-centered worldview doesn't leave us there. It gives us a better picture of life as well. And so we're going to look at Romans 12. We're back in Romans again, still that first century letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome. And here's the activity. We're going to read this long section of Scripture, and as we read, just start to form a list in your guide on what it looks like to live to the full in God's vision of life. If you need more time at the end, simply pause and take more time. But we're trying to build a picture of what it means to live the fullest life in God. So here we go, Romans 12. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it's written, "It's mine to avenge, I will repay," says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So that's how we want to leave you with this session, just with this activity of trying to paint a picture of what a full life in God's vision of life looks like. So again, just take some time with that text, go through it, and paint a picture of what it means to live to the fullest in God's vision of life. So because this week was what's wrong with the world, we're going to do a practice that may be a bit foreign to you, and I'll put it on the screen so you guys can look through it all, and it'll help you process it. But it may be uncomfortable, but it is a good practice, and it's a part of the ancient practice of contemplation. It's got a strange name and can definitely feel uncomfortable, but it's just been called sitting in your sin before God, which sounds like a lot of fun, right? But what you're going to do, the practice of what it looks like, is you'll take on a posture of openness, which might simply be sitting down with your hands up, resting on your legs or something like that, however you want to take, whatever posture you want to take. And then it's simply acknowledging your brokenness and weakness before God, and then in your heart or soul or mind's eye, whatever language you put around this, you are just sitting in your sin, but you're looking at God, looking on you in love. And you'll likely feel exposed. You might want to make excuses or false promises, but the goal of this practice is to avoid all of that. It's to acknowledge our fallenness, acknowledge that there is wrong in us, but at the same time, we have a loving God who looks on us in love. It's simply basking in the love of God without any excuse, promise, or anything else. So we hope you have time to do this practice this week, and look forward to another couple weeks with you. Next week, we'll kick off week 5. Thanks.